Hello, Andy Sharp. Welcome back to the show. It's good to see you again. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, great to see you again. Just being busy promoting the new book the last few
Your
weeks.
new book, The Astral Geographic, the Watkins Guide to the Occult World.
Yep.
Um, so, what drew you to write? Because the previous book was a kind of psychogeography kind of collection of stuff you'd done on the web, wasn't it? It was or like fanzine style
Yeah,
kind of stuff. Yeah.
fanzines.
And
Yeah,
this feels like a bit of a departure from that. Sort
yeah.
of.
So the English Heretic collection was an anthology of these kind of quite anarchic fanzines I'd done over about 15 years, and it just provided a point of closure because the kind of I didn't have an archive or anything like that, so it was actually quite useful for me to get this all in one place and close it off. So that did really well, and my publisher was Repeater, and a few months after that came out. Um, a commissioning editor from Watkins, who are Repeater's parent company, got in touch with me. So it was an in-house job. So essentially, we had a conversation. They enjoyed the book, and then they were asking about um, uh, would I be interested in doing something for them that was and they were saying, well, we do sort of pictures and colours and stuff like that. So I had we went through a few things, and I suggested um, something on the lines of the conceit of a travel guide, um, and we went through a number of sort of different ideas, and I eventually agreed on came to the idea of doing uh, a travel guide that sort of told the story of magic through geography. I mean, there's different ways of telling the story of magic, and but I thought there was it's not the only telling of magic, but it's a very interesting one that you can do through geography, and that really came through the kind of some of the stuff I've done with English Heretic, which is obviously largely occult psychogeography, but this was slightly less anarchic than that, really, because Watkins are a trade publisher, really. So the agreement was I would do something that was written in a slightly straighter style, and I came up with the idea of exploring, as I said, exploring different facets of esotericism through geography, and actually wanted to tell that in lots of different ways. So you got two aspects to that, really. You got like terrain, if you like gardens, deserts, stuff like that, and you've also got form different esoteric practices like witchcraft and Satanism and alchemy and tantra and things like that. So I thought tell that story in two different ways. So whilst it's from a personal point of view, um, I wanted to have a strong narrative arc there. So the actual idea of a travel guide was, in my to me, is a is a is a play with form, conceit, essentially. But it was a compromise between doing something that people could read as a travel guide, and my own personal desire to do something that had a strong narrative arc there. So play with form, as I always have done with English Heretic. So I think in the end it was a reasonable compromise. So yeah, so that's the sort of basis of it, really.
It's very appealingly, printed. I mean, I love the cover and the
Brilliant.
feel of it. Actually, I got definitely fetish for books and this sort of 70s, 60s retro kind of feel to it. And I love the artwork inside. It's very seductive in that sense, and that's got like that's very engaging. That's very draws you in. And was that part of how much influence did you have on the way it looked?
I pretty much had the entire say on that because I knew
Oh,
exactly the way I wanted to do it. I wanted to get away from this kind of like that sort of like that sort of horrible fantasy art you get in the occult, with like sort of a bit
There's some
porny.
truly dreadful occult
Yeah,
book covers, aren't there? Like,
yeah, and content. Even books I really love, like say Jan Fry's books. They're always kind of sport by this kind of weirdly kind of sort of cheesy sort of art. I'd also want to get away from that sort of over gothic way that the occult is done, because I always perceived the occult as quite psychedelic and very colourful, and I also wanted to jar the kind of heavy subject matter with something that was almost like playful, and the actual visual idea I had for it was there at the beginning, and that was from the Shell Guides to Britain. So these Shell Guides that came out from about the 1930s to, well, they're still going, I think, to a certain degree. They were like county guides, and the beginning of each chapter would have this kind of like annotated vignette, annotated sort of collage, illustrative collage of the county, and they got very good artists in there to do it, like people like Revilius and the Nash brothers and things like that. So that was very much straight from the outset. I wanted to do it like a shell guide. In actual fact, a few years ago, I'd done two or three sort of shell type tarot cards for a show involving people like Dean Kenning and John Cussons and things like that. So I'd actually played with that form before, but I got a guy called Nick Taylor in to do it. He's a very good sort of psychedelic hauntological retro illustrator. Does a lot of book covers and record labels, and he actually did the chapter illustrations for the English Heretic collection and the cover for English Heretic collection. So I'd worked with him before. So yeah, straight from the outset, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and more to the point, I wanted to use these illustrations as kind of like sort of bespoke proprietary tarot cards that had told a story of the chapter within them in a sort of heavily codified way, and had vignettes with it, had elements with that you could create sort of almost like archaeological vignettes that were used in the book to as illustrative guides, but in the final section they're actually used as visualization tools as well. So it was, it was pretty clear what I wanted to do.
It's interesting what you're saying about like occult art in general. I mean, I wonder where that Gothic style kind of came in, because if you look at stuff like, even Theosophy's kind of artwork and like the Golden Dawn, it's all very bright and very colourful. You like Steffi Grant stuff was often very
Exactly.
very kind of bright and colourful. So it's interesting that, I guess maybe it's a cultural thing because the occult was kind of adopted by that kind of aesthetic a little bit. It felt more like the occult was absorbed into that kind of, like you say,
Yeah,
gothy kind of like, yeah, maybe it's like one culture influencer in another kind of, maybe.
yeah. I think. Yeah, I'm trying to think where it went. I think that was kind of also I was quite used to be quite disappointed. But in actual fact, in some of the art in the Kenneth Grant books is quite sort of that sort of fancy art. You get people like Samuel Adkins and that guy Alan Holub and things like that, and it's quite kind of fancy art type stuff. So there was a crossover even in Grant's books, and I think that just sort of became quite dominant. And then obviously, you'd have it just became a chic in a way, that kind of very airbrush type fantasy art, really, isn't it? I guess.
Or very childlike art as well. There's some very, I remember, oh god, I could there's I don't want to
Don't mention names, but yeah.
yeah, I don't want to flame any books in particular, but there's some I've got that just blow my mind how bad they are. But yeah.
Yeah, I definitely didn't want to do it, but also to a certain degree didn't want to do that kind of portentous sort of, I've got a leather tome grimoire, that kind of stuff as well, that kind of sort of mock, sort of like weird library that this book is really worth like about £1 million, and and the devil's written it or something like that in someone's blood, that kind of aesthetic that you get a lot in the, it just doesn't appeal to me at all. The much more colourful stuff, as you said, Steffi Grant stuff, really
Yeah.
appeals to me. But also kind of like the Thoth deck as well, that
Mm.
tarot deck. It's just, it's
Yeah, it's very kind of Art Deco, isn't it? Almost.
yeah,
It's kind of, yeah.
exactly.
I
Yeah,
I
yeah.
noticed you adopt from the sun card the sun the how it's depicted in the actual card the sun
Oh
card
yeah, yeah.
in the actual book itself. It's reproduced a couple of times, isn't it? Yeah. If you were going to say no, I had nothing to do with how it looks, somebody else did that job, I was going to say, well, they did a fantastic job because they hit the nail on the head exactly where where you're coming from.
Yeah, it was a very tight. I gave. I think Nick worked very hard for the money that he got in the end, because I was very prescriptive about these chapters, and there was a lot of work for him. But it was like, yeah, I need that element there and this element there. But it was because it was, it goes through to the final practical section that it had to be like that, or else it would have just fallen by the wayside. So yeah.
And it's a
It
very
really-
appealing size. It's just the right size, not too big, not too small, but big enough so you can, like you can say, you can be seduced by the imagery.
It's like we're on
Yeah,
QVC or something at the moment, isn't it?
Huh?
It's like we're on QVC. It's like, look.
Wow.
yes.
Well, I mean, that's my
It would look like
honest
you and your-
appraisal. That is my honest appraisal. I mean, I'm not just saying it.
It's funny you should say that. I was very prescriptive about the size of the book as well,
There
because
we
it
are.
had to be
See?
square. Because if you a coffee table book, you sort of sit on your, and I always find them a bit too floppy,
Mm.
and that actually, that strange sort of like dimensions takes away um, the reading. So I did actually say I want it sort of square for this particular reason.
Mm.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, good point. I did. Yeah, things like that were yes, my demands. It's like Spinal Tap, don't I? If I want my voice, my rider.
Only in the best possible sense of it. And like you say, I mean, it makes you want to go. I mean, I've visited some of them myself. Some I wanted to go, need to go, want to go, never been to, and some I were completely new to me. So
Oh, that's
and
good.
if it gets people, if it gets people getting out their front doors into the real world, that's quite something. And you share something of your experiences there, which again brings it to life, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, a touch of experience, but not like it's not like a kind of yeah. That was a part of the conversation. I think if I'd had my way, it would be more of a travel, a bit of travel writing, and actually the first sort of sample copy, I think was more like travel writing, and they said no, we need to split it up into itineraries, and then you can go deep. Then then have this supplementary essay in each chapter that went deeper into the subject matter. So yeah, there was a bit compromise there, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in it, and what size it would have to be if you managed to do that. But I did come away wanting more of that the lived reality, the lived experience of various places,
Yeah,
and stuff
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. I
That's
mean, what
good.
was the most striking? What was the most lingering, or the most striking thing, or what stayed with you the most, or had the biggest surprise, or the
That's a good question. The biggest surprise for me was actually the tunnel complex at Bay, because I'd seen photographs of it, and I was actually quite underwhelmed by photographs of it. When you actually go down this tunnel entrance to the cave of the Sybil, it is actually quite trippy in a small way, and you get the whole kind of notion of the trapezoid sort of tunnel structure, and
Mm.
exactly why it would have been quite something for the visitor there, because these half along this tunnel, you would have these plays of light coming in, and having false, supposedly having false tunnels where people were like rattling chains and doing this sort of performative magic was actually quite. It suddenly um, came, the photographs and what you see, and even the description to a certain degree. Don't prepare you for the reality of it. So in that way, I was quite surprised. It was not necessarily the most outlandish place I've been to. Obviously, like the gardens in Sintra are pretty outlandish, and Basilica of the Holy Blood in Bruges and places like that are pretty amazing, you know. But in actual fact, that was quite informative in a kind of of how those places could induce or were designed to induce altered states of consciousness, and that was very interesting.
What was the most atmospheric place? You do mention actually something about going down that tunnel. Just that stuck with me actually. It's
Yeah,
interesting you
yeah.
say that. But what was the most atmospheric place?
Well, I mean, the most uncanny experience I definitely had, and the strangest experience was when I went to Namur in Belgium. So I went down there to look at to visit Felician Rops's museum. And as I went there, and as I went towards the museum, I went past this really pretty ornate church, and I felt like I need to visit that after visiting the museum. There was some pull there, so I went to visit the museum, and there was a lot about his Rops's relationship with Baudelaire that I wasn't realised how close they were in terms of their kind of obsessions, and they had a lot of like the engravings for Baudelaire's poetry and stuff like that. So I came away, and then I just thought, right, before I go home, I'm going to go and look in this church, and it was, had this kind of it's kind of almost quasi-Masonic sort of black and tough, cream sort of ornate architecture, and it's really quite amazing sort of altars and things like that with these. That was actually, I felt, that was a strange atmosphere, because I thought there's a kind of satanic Catholicism here, and I thought it feels like the kind of filigraries of a Rops painting, and they had this bizarre sort of really kind of quite pagan looking confessional, and and I thought that's really interesting. I'll write that and make sure that I put something in there. And then anyway, I got home and just was researching it. And found out that Baudelaire had visited that church while he was visiting Frisian Rops, and he'd been marveling at this kind of like it's kind of I can't remember what he called it, threatening atmosphere, and had a seizure, and that led to his death. And I think that was the most uncanny, weird atmosphere that I had of a place that was actually borne out by what I found out later. So there was nothing preconceived in why I went there, and I always think that's where the real kind of the rapport exists. And English Heretic was always about the rapport. It wasn't a stage sort of investigation of various occult figures. It was a kind of obsessional thing where these characters draw you in, and that was a classic case. And it was down to the atmosphere, and it was down to kind of some sort of pull. I could have easily just ignored it, and I always think that's the truth of any kind of investigation.
It led down an unexpected alley, probably literally.
literally, yeah, an uncanny alley, and in a sense that genuinely supernatural experience, if you like. You're not going to get that all the time everywhere you go. Even if and I'm I kind of try and be quite not skeptical, but I try to make sure I'm not like just looking for occult coincidence and things like that. So I think that's where that's quite a powerful experience.
Yeah, I strive to be an open-minded skeptic, and so it's like a balancing act, and I don't always get it right by any means. But yeah, it's interesting how that led to an experiencing, and it's a synchronicity that couldn't be ignored actually, or shook off. It sounds like.
Yeah, and also a big part of the chapter, so it became a huge part of the narrative, really. An important part. I think you can. It's important to include those, as long as you're not overly, to a certain degree. I was looking for looking for connections a lot in English Heretic. You know, it was a kind of exercise in hyperconnectivity, whereas this wasn't so much an exercise in hyperconnectivity, and therefore the things that made connections are a little bit more subtle and a little bit more measured, really, than the sort of anarchic sort of apophenia in English Heretic, really.
Excellent. Yeah.
Helps if I turn my microphone back on, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. Ken.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
We were enjoying ourselves.
So, what is your actual take on occultism and like high strangeness and stuff? Where are you coming from in terms of belief and?
Well, you know, I think it's I believe in kind of like essentially, you know, the supernatural power of the imagination, you know, and and a kind of ontological paranoia that you get in people like Philip K. Dick and Robert Anton Wilson. You know, I think that's the way I see it, really, as something to be enjoyed and something to take your own mind in a particular kind of psychedelic direction, really. So yeah, one of the things, exactly, I started thinking about when I was writing the book and about my belief system is because obviously I've got a medical background, so I study neuroscience and things like that. So I've got I've got a training in kind of reductive thinking and things like that, but obviously got interested in occultism, and I think in the truth of that is, you know, it's I enjoy that kind of delirious other reality, really, and I've always needed that, really. Partly, you know, because conventional reality is quite boring, to be honest, and I think that's always tapped into that. And one of the things that I sort of explored in the kind of theoretical section was this idea of magical consciousness, really, and magical thinking as being a different mode of thinking, you know, a mode based on association rather than kind of logic and reduction. And that, you know, I quote Susan Greenwood's book on magical consciousness, and the work of like Patrick McNamara, who actually wrote a really good book on neuroscience of nightmares. But he talks about a process of decentering, which is a kind of a conscious overriding of what he calls like the process of the ego. So he sees the ego as a process rather than the thing, and this process is a kind of tight feedback mechanism in the sort of frontal cortex that maintains this kind of logical center, and that you can actually choose to, through whatever psychedelics or magical practice or ecstatic ritual and things like that, to move away, to decenter from this. And the argument is that this sort of like conscious decentering that's obviously facilitated by guides and people who are going to keep you in, you know, from completely going off the rails, is actually, you know, quite a healthy process for reintegrating the ego in a with the knowledge of this other way of thinking. And there's a good argument that I read that saying, you know, kind of patronizing way that people perceive primitive tribal thought process as magical, and the idea and I can't remember which book, I think it was in the Season Room, where someone said, well, yeah, they know exactly how, you know, the so-called primitive people know exactly how to think reductively. It's just they don't choose to, you know. So that's really my perception of, you know, my whole interest in magic and occultism, is that it's a conscious decision to think of to experience life in a different way, you know. That you know, you know, you can live life logically, but you can also choose to have a part of your life that lives life associatively, you know, in a kind of dream state and things like that.
Yeah, and sometimes logic only allows us to be wrong with authority. I mean, it's interesting with I mean, there's a classic balance there between, in the Western esoteric tradition of the sort of dark pillar and the white pillar, and the different parts of the left and right brain and so on. I mean, yeah, I relate to that. I mean, from my own experiences, yeah, ultimately, it has changed me, and there's certain experiences which I won't go into, where which I can't by any in all conscience dismiss or explain away in a conventional way. And but then what space does that occupy? And for want of a better word, it's a very clumsy, clunky word, and they are supernatural in that sense that I can't account for them.
Yeah, but yeah, as I said, I think one of the interests I had in that kind of, especially the work of Joris Karl Huysman, is this kind of supernatural realism that he had in his work, and I think that's what makes his stuff so powerful. And I for a while I've been thinking about this idea of if you look at nature close enough, it becomes supernature. That things become that the closer you look at something, the stranger it is. And you certainly get that in kind of things like physics, and molecular biology. In terms of how memory works, it becomes really, really, really strange. The whole process of how we remember and things like that, and the whole kind of system of like, this whole idea of how memories are created, and the neuroplasticity is almost like in itself. It becomes, when you start looking at biology in that way, it becomes this kind of quite miraculous thing in a weird way.
Yeah, supernature, supernaturalism, tomato. But these words are like, they're incomplete. All these models are incomplete and temporary
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we
Yeah,
are, and
yeah,
that's and the mystery is the lived reality. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and also making a choice to live magically.
yeah, under
And
will.
things becomes more magical the more you engage with it. The whole kind of principle of alchemy is all about that. That you don't suddenly step out there and analyze it to the sense that the magic is taken away. You live in this kind of hermetic reality.
Mm. Yeah. So in the book, you break down the sort of sections into routes, different journeys you can go on.
Yeah.
And you start off with Satan and his places. And the one that I found quite interesting, I was wondering, have you been to Dejet in it's actually Jedet, isn't it, in
No, I
Egypt?
haven't. No, that was one of the places I haven't been. No, but I mean, it is accessible. Yeah, yeah, and it does look absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. There seems to be a lot of kind of Satan crossover in Egypt, in ancient Egypt,
Yeah,
especially.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a very good book called City of the Ram God, I think. It's an archaeological study. But what kind of amazed me was the size of these kind of statues that they'd have, um, and just this, sheer scale of the kind of worship there, really. But obviously, there's kind of all this kind of, um, idea that there was this kind of like cult that was mating with, um, rams and things like that, and whether, again, and a lot of these, certainly in the Satanism chapter, what I found is, is the kind of the dance between the real kind of sense of some sort of satanic practice and the propaganda, so that it seems to be a constant throughout the journey in a sense, and I thought that was a really interesting part, that you could trace, much as you could trace the kind of sacrificial practice, you could also trace the propaganda that generated that. And I think that's a really interesting sort of subtext in that chapter. So you had, like, the idea that Herodotus went to Mendes and said, "Oh yeah, they're all practicing bestiality there," and that's propaganda, Greek propaganda. Then you had the same thing in Carthage. You had the same thing with the Irish Hellfire Clubs and the rise of like unionism and things like that. And you suddenly see that, wow, there's, and then also in you know in Houston's times as well. There was this kind of parallel sort of political element to kind of exposing Satanism as well. So,
Yeah, I mean, I mean, what his particular take on the, I mean, it led to that's where the phrase "the goat of Mendes" comes from. but but yeah, as you say, it's a ram, a black ram specifically. I mean,
Yeah,
black
yeah.
is the color of good in the Egyptian worldview, and red is evil. If you go to Egypt, the desert, the desolate desert, is like a reddish sort of color,
Okay, yeah, yeah. That's
and the loam next to the Nile is the black's fertile soil. It's fertile, so it's connected with ideas of fertility. If he was just amazed by, like, it was just like this extraordinary custom. It's not clear to me, but yeah, and there's something lost in translation with the ram that crosses over into the goat. But then you got Azazel, the scapegoat, in the Hebrew Testament
okay.
scripture,
Yeah, yeah.
and that sort of all sort of segues in, so it all sort of, there's a narrative there as well. You can sort of see the sort of magical DNA in Baphomet's, the
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And
uh,
as you know, Levi's sort of like kind of
this is it.
description it as this sort of sort of kind of monstrous complex that's visible through different ages. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, which he identifies as a scarecrow to the profane. It's not the simple personification of evil that it appears to be. It's far more, a transgressive figure. Totally. When you think of in that Victorian image, you've got clearly male and female symbols put together. That would be, that the potency of that is, I think, still with us. Because
Yeah,
it's,
yeah,
that
yeah,
caduceus between its legs is clearly a phallus, and it's a polite version of the phallus, maybe, but it's still, that must have been that image would have a shocking effect, and it's still a startling image, isn't it? Which is part of its potency. I think that's why its magic is still with us.
yeah, yeah. And the other thing about Levi, he was again like there was this political element to his magic as well, because I mean he was a socialist, wasn't he? And I can't remember the June uprising. He had to sort of denounce his socialism, and the occultism actually was a mask for their kind of socialist utopia, really, and sort of involving elements of feminism and stuff like that. There's a guy called Julian Straub, is it, who's written quite a lot about Levy and the kind of um, all the socialist strand to his occultism and things like that. So
And the Catholic, it brings us back to the French Victorian Catholic, atmosphere again, because he trained for the priesthood and then
yeah,
had a bit of
yeah,
a crisis of conscience. So that's, yeah, it's all in there.
yeah. So yeah, it's a very, very complex figure. I mean, I don't think I had time to do it justice. So in that chapter, I had to kind of gloss over the stuff that I would have ordinarily really liked to dig into, in terms of the complexity and the moral complexity of it.
Yeah, one location in the first route as well is one that's near and dear to Mark and I. Is the Hellfire Club locations, and we've many a time visited
Yeah.
the Dashwood Estate. We went to estate recently. We went to the Hellfire Caves, the mausoleum, which is based on
Oh
the
yeah, yeah,
Abbey
yeah,
of Thelema, and yeah. So, what drew you to include the Hellfire Club into
yeah.
this?
Well, it's because it's. Uh, I think that the chapter would have been. It would have been a big miss if I hadn't put the Hellfire Club in. But I'd seen quite a few guides that obviously used West Wickham and things like that, and the Hellfire Caves, and I wanted to do a slightly different angle. I had a friend over in Dublin who sent me a book on the Irish Hellfire Clubs, and it was fascinating. They were, and also
Mm.
the kind of mythic drift from the kind of the London Hellfire Clubs, the Irish Hellfire Clubs was quite interesting. This kind of this idea that you burnt alive a servant, um, which is quite common to the kind of the London Hellfire Clubs that actually happened in reality in Ireland. So I was actually, so again, it was a slightly, I felt I needed to put something in about the Hellfire Clubs because it's a kind of, I wanted to put in not just the kind of the historical sort of elements of Satanism, but also the kind of almost the kind of vaudeville elements of, or the gentleman's club, and the kind of whole pretense of Satanism. I think this is quite an important thing to actually include it in there as well, because it is kind of confused really, and you still see that in LaVey and people like that. You know, this pretense of evil, and charade and game and things like that. So, but yeah, the Irish Hell Club is very interesting. The books on it are good, and um, we went up to the Montpellier Hill, had a long climb up there to the hunting lodge that was supposedly the centre of the Irish Hellfire Clubs.
Yeah, there's some contention to whether that actually was their location, isn't there? But
Yeah. Again, like it's an interesting. So they started off in Dublin, in this place that's now kind of Quakers meeting centre. But again, it was the same place that was used by like kind of the burgeoning sort of unionist movement. So, you know, the Hellfire Club on Montpellier Hill, yeah, again, was, you know, it's just legend really that suggests that there was a meeting place for.
there's a great story related to that, isn't there? With are they playing poker or something? And
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
and the gentleman turns up, and do you know this story?
Well, he turns out to be the devil or something like that.
They're all drinking, and someone drops something on the ground and looks down and sees that the hoof-footed one, sees the cloven hooves, whatever, of instead of feet, and then it all burns down, and that's why it burnt down. That's the kind of infamous myth.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, and then also the other story that was about supposedly built on these kind of from the stones from this old kind of Neolithic
Burial ground. Yeah.
intrigue and that. It had to be a big burial mound, you know. So whether they used like a foundation stone or something like that. But again, you know, the backstory on that, it was probably used as a hideout for Unionists on the run. So you can imagine, you know, kind of right, don't go up there because, you know, there's Satanists up there, you know, and there's bad goings on. Whereas in actual fact, it's a hideout, really. You know, so it's a great way of kind of, you know, keeping people off the trail of your sort of political practices and whatever.
And that fable of the playing cards with the devil, and he's like the realization that's who it is. That there's another location on Ireland, and the same in Ireland as well, where it's associated with another building, so it's obviously doing the rounds in that part of the world. It might not be inconceivable that some of the building was rebuilt from older material. I mean, if you take, you mentioned it as well, Avebury, many of the houses there were actually constructed from broken stones, from the stones in the circle.
Yeah,
So
I didn't.
they were, so it's not
Yeah,
inconceivable.
I mean that's a good point actually. I mean it could be. Because you would have thought it had to be local stone because it's like, you know, where would you quarry it from? Because it's, you know, it's miles away up in a hill, you know. So yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with Avebury, at one point they were more reverent towards the stones. The church, as you must know, well, you do know, is built outside the circle. It's almost like it hasn't got Christianity at that point hasn't got the confidence to be right, slap bang and things. Usually, churches get built right on top of stuff, don't they?
Yeah.
And then in the earlier period, they buried the stones. They didn't destroy them, so they dug pits and buried the stones. And even within relative recent time, they've discovered hidden stones, you know. But then later, they were far more stringent and built pits underneath the stones, you know, lay them across and built fires and then poured water on them to shatter them. And those shattered fragments became houses. So there's like a pub just outside West Kennet Longbarrow, that's where it is. I can't remember the name of it, but that whole pub is built from the shattered
Right,
remains of
that's
the,
interesting, isn't it? Because
yeah.
there's all that information that's come out recently. That guy, I think, a kind of guy who set marmalade factory. He was the guy who kind of rebuilt Avebury, wasn't he? And dug them all up in the 30s and things like that. And as you say, I was quite shocked that what we see today wasn't what we saw in like kind of 1920s. It was, as you say, it all been pulverized. Yeah, I'd heard this recently. I don't know
Have you been to West Wickham to the
Yeah,
location
yeah, a
there?
good few times. Yeah, yeah,
The estate's fantastic, isn't it? Have you been on the actual Dashwood estate?
yeah,
Opposite
yeah,
on the road
yeah.
opposite the Hellfire Caves with their Volvic kind of
Oh yeah, the Temple of Venus,
yeah.
which is a very, from an anatomical point of view, has a very interesting front entrance.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we,
I mean, I really like. I kind of prefer the estate with the mausoleum and the church as well. You know, kind of.
mm.
Um,
The secret passage apparently between
yeah,
the
yeah,
caves and the church, isn't there?
Is
And
this
yeah.
the
Kind of
Temple of
well
Venus?
imagined.
Is this the Temple of Venus we're talking
no,
about?
the caves. Yeah, yeah, that would be a different sort of secret passage. But yeah,
Well, it's not that secret because
no,
it's pretty obvious.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
pretty obvious.
It's always quite funny when you know the story of why it's shaped in a vaginal way. Um, and you see like families posing next to it. You're just like, oh god.
It's brilliant. Yeah, yeah,
If only they knew. It's
Yeah.
remember when we were there. I remember this is a bit of a side note, but we were there and this troop of old people turned up, and there was like obviously on a day trip, and there was like 15 of them. And I remember I think you'd wandered off somewhere, but I've got a photograph of all these like old people stood around this kind of it's one of my favorite photographs I think I've ever
The
taken.
gates of
they're
light.
raging
Yeah,
Satanists from Rose
yeah, exactly.
Baby,
Yeah,
aren't they? Really, they're just
yeah,
pretending to be.
It's
I
the
always
gates of
think if I
life.
see, always
yeah.
think Rose Baby here.
They're yeah.
And you've actually been to the Georgian Vulture, yes? The chop house, the
Yeah,
pub
yeah,
shop, yeah. Is it
yeah.
worth? Well, yeah, I want to go there. So,
It's
uh,
all right. Yeah, it's great. Quite expensive. So it's quite expensive.
yeah. Is it a
Yeah,
chop house? Is it a chop
yeah,
house?
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's open at very funny times, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's not open. It's only open city hours, isn't it? Really, or something.
Mm.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
right in the because it's
yeah.
right. It's near Liverpool Street
That's
Station and
right.
that
Yeah, yeah,
sort of
yeah.
kind of area. That's on my list
Oh, you should
because
definitely
I
go.
got a bit excited when I was reading about it because I want to go to see that, and it was in the basement of Georgian Vulture that the Hellfire Club of all Hellfire Club, the proto Hellfire Club, they met there. That's right, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
they had the lamp, the rose, what is called the Rosicrucian lamp, for whatever, rightly or wrong, whatever. This esoteric lamp, certainly Masonic lamp, esoteric lamp, that was hung in the basement, which is probably the kitchen now or something like that. No, I
yeah.
dare
But
say.
that's also West Wickham, isn't it? As well. There's there's a mention of Rosicrucian lamp as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Right at the end of the caves, in the Holy of Holies, or Unholies as it may be, right underneath the church, where they've got the delightfully kitsch
Waxworks.
waxworks. Yeah,
Mhm.
there's like a reproduction of it. It doesn't do it justice, but there's a reproduction of it there. I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting.
I think it'd be quite ineffable. I think it's quite ineffable, this Rosicrucian lamp, isn't it? You know.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that's an object. I mean, it's obviously it might turn up on bargain hunt or something, but if that's an object that's like a kind of holy grail type of a holy an unholy
I think,
relic.
yeah. I mean, again, I could have really. There's a whole kind of, the kind of links, the Rosicrucian links in a lot of the chapters. Really, I could have gone down whole.
Yeah,
It could have been a lot bigger, and certainly did start writing about the kind of the symbolism of the Rosicrucian lamp. But again, it was I can't remember. I was tied to sort of 6,000 words per chapter and things like that, and you just um, there's definitely stuff that I would have liked to explore in more detail, and
You could
in
do it.
fact that's life, isn't it? You go on and discover more and more. Someone like the interesting characters and leads and things like that. So um, yeah,
Perhaps you could do it. You could do a supplementary fanzine or something. That would be
well, funny you should say that. Yeah, I mean, I'd kind of suggest because they're looking at ways to further promote the book, and I suggested that actually I could switch it, switch it around from English Heretic to a certain degree, and also people like Weird War can do it the other way around, and actually I think
mm.
it will work really well because I wouldn't have the editorial kind of sort of restrictions on it, so I would just take the name, and if something wanted to, so it would get a lot more grantian, to be honest, and it'd be cool. I kind of think it'd be on the Astral Geographic, and it would just but basically every issue would be just about getting grant weird stuff, you know, if I didn't home it in. But there was a lot, you know, there was a whole section on in the necromancy chapter. I got interested in kind of the necromancy involved with like ship burials in Norway and things like that. That was actually really fascinating, and I had to chop out, you know, maybe 1,000 words on that. But I'm hoping to head to Denmark and explore that a bit more in May, you know. And I don't know whether you read that book by that series of books by Shanae Oates about Odin.
Oh, I've got one of them. I haven't finished reading it yet, but I've got the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just finished reading that, and so I'm going to go to Ardennes and visit some of the locations for these hanging cults. So obviously, kind of, there's this whole kind of stuff that's come out of that, really, you know, and links between sort of you know, Burroughs hanging cults and Norse hanging cults. So you just, you know, your life just progresses into the weird, you know.
Yeah. I was interested that you brought up the William Westerfield house in this as well. That's
yeah.
That's like that's somewhere I want to visit personally as well, because of the mad amount of stuff that's happened there. It's especially, you know, the Kenneth Anger stuff. Yeah.
It's almost like a sort of countercultural, sort of interdimensional kind of countercultural place that's, you know, it's like a metafiction itself, isn't it? You know, and all these kind of, you know, you could easily imagine like kind of sort of an Alan Moore type thing just existing in his house, and that's why I wanted that illustration to very much point out the kind of the William Westerfield house in the chapter, because I felt it was this kind of like, you know, sort of metafictional paradise, really, or you know, hell, infernal paradise, or whatever. But yeah, you know, obviously the thing that really interested me in that was the juxtaposition between the locations that we used in Invocation of My Demon Brother. Was it? Yeah, Invocation of My Demon Brother, where the two most pointy collage sequences in that cut from LaVey doing this kind of pseudo voodooistic ritual with a skull, then it cuts to the Stones playing, and then later they're doing the ceremony going down the stairs, and Bobby Beausoleil's at the end of it, and it cuts to the Stones again. I just thought, that's definitely kind of cut-up magic going on there, you know, between the house and Ultimate and stuff like that. And that was, you know, that was again, I could have done a lot more on the kind of Kenneth Anger's sort of magic, really, you know. Again, I had to touch on it, but yeah, I think there's something very potent about Anger's use of that place in the film as well.
And rest in peace, obviously. Rest in peace, Kenneth Anger.
Yeah.
Well, since we, definitely since we last spoke, he's sort of passed away. 95, 90, something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I've not been able to find anything. I've asked everybody who should know, and I've persistently asked them, and I've found nothing about his funeral. Absolutely nothing.
Right. No.
It's conspicuous by its absence, the coin phrase. But what's also conspicuous by its absence is that there is a story circulate, you know, where there is no story, people will make stuff up, but I haven't heard stuff made up either. So so if anybody out there knows anything about it, probably I'm asking for. I don't want to fable. I want to because I've asked everybody who should know, and nobody who should know or heard something has been able to tell me.
We should ask Brian Butler, really. I mean, I speak to him quite regularly. So yeah. No, Brian Butler was his kind of kind of assistant towards the end, I think, producer, assistant,
carer,
yeah, it seemed like, at some point. Yeah. So the other house from that chapter, you know, not to linger too much on one chapter, it's just it's my thing, I suppose. It's the Process Church house.
Yeah. It's a fascinating kind of structure in itself, a hierarchical structure. Yeah.
We actually interviewed Timothy Wiley on this show before he died. Quite a few years ago. He was more interested in talking about dolphins and ketamine than he was about the Process Church, which is interesting. But it was kind of. But yeah, did you visit the exterior at least?
Yeah. It's quite funny because I went there and there was this kind of Instagram couple, like influencers there, having their photograph taken at number 4. and they were like, I said, you want to go outside number 2? That's where the really cool stuff is at. So it was quite funny seeing this kind of a whole area being sort of, because it's very high end, isn't it? And but in a sense, that's that was what it was. That's very much part of the kind of cultic sort of hierarchy there, wasn't it? In terms of the way that the majority the group lived in sort of like kind of like dormitories, and then you had the hierarchy in a sort of secluded space. But yeah, I mean that was more. I mean, I'm fascinated by the kind of the imagery of that building was used a lot in their zines, wasn't it? There was a process house, and they would have it, this sort of sinister angle, wouldn't it? That it would be taken at, and the whole idea of this kind of Satan's cavern, where Brian Epstein off his face on Valium would be sort of hanging around with Tibetan Rinpoche and things like that. Sounded amazing, just like the whole kind of. Again, very Grantian, that sort of mix of kind of psychedelia and Satanism, where you sort of psychedelic Satanism, if you like. Yeah.
Satan's coffee shop as well.
Yeah. Brilliant.
William Burroughs and the chap who did the Pink Flamingos. They all foregathered there as well. So
did they? John Walters.
John Walters, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's the most unlikeliest.
Oh yeah.
He talks about his own account of being there and talking to the people and saying, well, they're quite welcoming him, and people who were marginalized didn't fit into the mainstream. They were, that was a good place to go because they were okay about that. They were fine.
Yeah. I mean, and also I think it just, it was a very striking. I mean, just, I read quite a bit for the book, and I bought, the reissues of the magazines, and I hadn't quite twigged how much of an influence they were on Templar Psychic Youth, how much wholesale they kind of borrowed their kind of aesthetic, the Alsatians and stuff like that, and the kind of very striking sort of collage, imagery, walls, things like that, and this whole kind of, quite formidable form of kind of, occultism that isn't, again, we're going to say, I particularly liked early kind of Temple of Psychic Use, the aesthetic. I thought it was amazing, the collages and things like that. And the whole kind of branding in a way was very potent, really. And I guess that was, to be honest, is you can see Peter Christopherson in there. That kind of very shrewd eye for something very subversive.
Yeah, definitely. So moving into the necromancy section, the one that struck us was the St Leonard's Church.
Oh yeah.
And Mark has a.
Is that Walton De Lacy? Is that right?
Walton Dale.
Yeah. Yes. Did you actually visit that?
I did, yeah, and I had a quite strange experience there.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, I mean, what's quite interesting about that place is that most of the gravestones are from the 18th, 17th century. So it's been knocked down and rebuilt a few times. So, the actual church topography, the church architecture is exactly as you see in those kind of mezzotints or whatever.
That famous etching.
Although it's more sloping, the kind of the graveyard slopes down. It's not flat. But when I was there, I was like I was actually up coming back from a holiday in Cumbria. My family are from Cumbria, so they're Sharps, and I was in the graveyard, and I was sort of taking some photographs, and I found myself standing on this tombstone that was a Sharp tombstone. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Anyway, I was walking around. It started raining, and this old guy who looked very much like my granddad type. My granddad worked in steelworks, and kind of this strong, stoical type figure. And he started walking past me, and he had this big black dog that he was walking, and I was kind of hi, and and he goes, oh, there's going to be rain in the clouds and that sort of stuff. And it felt quite a strange sort of meeting. Anyway, so I went to the car, and then he just sort of came straight back, as if he had just sort of come to meet me and then just gone straight back rather than going on his walk. So it's quite an odd sort of, again, it's one of those sort of things, possibly not, again, not worth putting in the book because it was a quite personal sort of anecdote, but there was a strong sense of, kind of that sort of psychopompic sort of goings on that you occasionally get. So that was quite a strange experience that I wasn't expecting there, really. But
Yeah, it's one of the locations I've yet to visit. Again, my sort of astral ears pricked up when it was in there. There's also a suggestion, a tradition that part of the reason Kelly was there was on a treasure hunt. There was a treasure hunt element to it, and
was there? I didn't realise that. I mean, the stuff I read was that he was sort of invited by a sort of middleman of a kind of lord that wanted to know about his death, or was worried about his death, or worried that people were after him. But I didn't know about the treasure hunting aspect. But
there could have been on more than one occasion. And funny
yeah,
enough, there was a tradition that if you stood in the graveyard, you would be in sight of buried treasure. So it would be in sight. Obviously it's buried, so you can't see it. But you know what I mean. It would be in your, it would be
The
it's not
access
visible.
point would be,
Yeah. It would be within sort of reach, so to speak.
okay,
And curiously, in the I think it's 1950s, there was a archaeological dig on the river nearby or bank nearby, and they found a Saxon hoard in there in about 1950s. So that might have been a folk memory as well.
right.
Oh, it's possible actually. They did there's another possibility is that they didn't go there for that reason, but that's sort of become incorporated. The folklore. It's like a folk memory of there is a hoard there, and it was discovered in the 50s. So, but if you did stand in the church, you would be, it would be in sight, so to speak. Yeah.
Oh, that's
So,
interesting. The other interesting aspect there is that John Dee was given permission to dig for treasure at Sutton Hoo, wasn't
yeah, that's true.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
In Glastonbury, he also dug about for
did he
stuff.
as well? Yeah. So
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
tradition of kind of the old kind of digging for Anglo-Saxon
yeah.
So
ore, really.
let's talk a bit about because I'm kind of interested in this as well, which is the Fulcinelli Lingua Verte. Could you tell us what that is? Because
Yeah,
it's like
I
a
mean,
strange form of alchemy or something, isn't it? It's
yeah, I mean, Lingua Verde means green language, but essentially what it is uh, a sort of magical language based on punning and double entendre and things like that. So whereas you've got Kabbalism, Hebrew Kabbalah, which is a sort of numerical equivalent, in Fulcanelli's Kabbalah, it's essentially like wordplay. But what I got really interested in was, I'm interested in the whole concept of like magical wordplay and double meaning, and also the way that you can look at sort of Christian texts and read a double meaning by wordplay. That's very much in Fulcanelli's sort of canon. But also, I was interested in why he was kind of obsessed with this kind of pathological, not pathological as in disease, but this kind of compulsive kind of wordplay that his books are. And the tradition with the traditional perception of Fulcanelli, or whoever Fulcanelli was, Jean-Julien Champagne and Eugene Cancelier, is that they were taking absinthe in order to kind of hallucinate and things like that. But in actual fact, it seems that they were taking a concoction of galbanum and hashish, and I think that's what gave rise to the kind of wordplay that's associated with kind of stoner sort of language and things like that. And then the green language starts to make sense in terms of cannabis, and also how Fulcanelli sees Rabelais' work as a massive sort of alchemical sort of play that's based on hashish and things like that. So I think the Lingua Verde is a kind of stoner language, literally, stoner. double, whatever, philosophical stoners. And I think that's where it's really interesting, because I think I think what's happening with Fulcanelli, that he's kind of accessing this kind of waking dream state that's kind of similar to what you see in James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, and also the kind of thing that Robert Anton Wilson was looking at. It's kind of like kind of linguistic synchronicities and things like that. And obviously, and Robert Anton Wilson was a massive fan of James
Joyce.
Finnegan's Wake. So I think this. I think what happens in a kind of dream state, and certainly having done written fiction and writing that actively tries to get in a waking dream state, is that you end up in this kind of area where visual puns and wordplay kind of predominate. And what's interesting in terms of Fulcanelli's work is that it kind of relates to what Freud thought, the pre-linguist, or the not the pre-linguistic, but the pre-literate language of dreams is. Because if you think about it, in your dreams, is that you can't spell. You're in a pre-literate state, but what happens is that things become phonetic. So you will start to make phonetic associations in your dream, as well as kind of imagistic ones. And this is very much tied in with the idea of the rebus that Freud was interested in. He thought that there was a kind of a sort of a phonetic pre-literate basis for dreams that was called the rebus, which is again used in heraldry. So you'll see puns in heraldry, and again Fulcanelli looks at heraldry, and there's a place in London, there's the oriel window at St Bart's Church that's got a bolt and a ton, and it's a kind of pun of the prior who ran it, called Bolton, and this appears in Fulcanelli's Dwellings of Philosophers. And I think it's amazing that you can wander into London and see this kind of key image that's crucial to kind of understanding Fulcanelli.
And the iconography, the visual iconography of Notre Dame, and the whole, that's I mean, that's I mean, there's stoner in the in the Masonic sense. You see what I've done there? You see, I'm doing a bit of the green language myself.
He's really stoned.
Yeah, it's stoner. It's stoner in the sense that he's literally looking at the masonry and the chiseled imagery of the
and
cathedral.
His argument was that I kind of think what he did was a kind of like would be doing kind of astral time travel. I think they were experimenting with galbanum and hashish, and then kind of doing kind of projections to a kind of medieval, astral version of the cathedral, and then riffing on the things they saw and things like that. And I think this is kind of way that's my perception of the working mechanism.
One place that interested me was the Holyrood Palace Gardens. That kind of object that's there. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, kind of.
Yeah, again, it turns up in, so Fulcanelli's like kind of most recognised book is The Mystery of the Cathedrals, but there's another text called The Dwellings of the Philosophers, which is kind of more diffuse. But what's always struck me with this is these kind of really kind of quite obscure places where he sees like alchemical tradition. And so the Holyrood sundial is in Edinburgh in the Guards of Holyrood Palace. It's actually an incredibly beautiful kind of almost like a crystal, and it has these very ornate sort of green men type figures, suns and moons and things like that, and the thistles and things like that. And so Fulcanelli really goes to town on it and says it's actually kind of a depiction of the Emerald Tablet, and it divulges the whole alchemical process. And there's again, he's kind of looking at he sort of decomposes it into various kind of linguistic sort of alchemical ciphers and things like that. I don't think I really had time to go into all of that, but it's pretty, it's pretty rich in the actual book itself. But he also relates it to a Scottish alchemist who I think if you look at the character of Fulcanelli himself, he's like this composite of various kind of alchemical legends, and you can certainly see him in Alexander Seton. His name is, I'm trying to remember his name. Who was an alchemist who kind of claimed to have the secrets to creating the Philosopher's Stone, and I think he was tortured or something like that in Prague or something like that, and managed to escape. But again, it's got this kind of really kind of bizarre, rich life story. And so the supposition is that somehow he's associated with this sundial in Hollywood.
And you use it, Mr. Sharp, on the front of one of your albums, isn't it?
I did, yeah. So I mean, I did an album with a friend of mine, Grail, and that was mainly based around sort of Edinburgh location. So I was kind of writing this book at the time and sort of tied it in. So I've kind of used it in two different places. Yeah. So, but I've been obsessed with it for just the beauty of it. Actually going up and just studying it and seeing, because it's all kind of covered in verdigris, and it's actually just, it's a pretty psychedelic sort of object in itself.
It looks quite unique, isn't it? I can't think of anything exactly like it.
Apparently, there's a few similarish ones there's a couple in Scotland that might be by the same person, but not that many. Yeah. But it's this kind of tradition of kind of these kind of quite sort of peculiar sundials. There's a great site that's all dedicated to sundials. It's quite interesting if you ever get to visit.
One thing I spotted of perhaps a missed chance here is that the initiatory section starts on page 93, and had you shunted the Crowley section to you would have had a so maybe for the reprint, for the second edition, switch the chapter.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, probably. I didn't notice that.
But I was interested in the desert. Is it Desert Durets and George Bataille in that section? Yeah. Could you talk a little bit to that kind of the kind of connection between the two? It was the kind of fascinating rituals that he was allegedly.
So that's Bataille. That's George Bataille's Society Asophile. I mean, I visited that 10, 15 years ago. A friend of mine, Agnes, was very interested in Bataille, and I don't really know John Cousins, who wrote a book called Undead Uprising, who's a kind of expert on voodooism, and he wrote a book on voodooism, but he was looking at kind of the connection between these kind of like revolutionary sacrifice and things like that. So Desert Durets is a folly garden in a forest called Marly Forest, just outside Paris, and it's sort of got lots of traditional sort of follies that you would expect, like a Temple of Apollo and a pyramid and things like that. And it was, supposedly designed as a sort of Masonic initiation path and things like that. And got a lovely kind of tin Saracen tent as well that's kind of painted pink and blue, really pretty ornate. So that fell into quite serious disrepair and has been sort of remanaged in the 80s. But it was a meeting point for the Surrealists because of its bizarreness, really. But Bataille's Society Asophile was dedicated to sort of this concept of the headless society, and they were interested in kind of inaugurating some kind of revolutionary sacrifice, and so they devised all these kind of almost like performative actions, really, and one of them was to take place outside this tree struck beneath this tree struck by lightning in the Marly Forest, where they would have one of them would be sacrificed in order to basically their argument was to gird the rest of the society's loins against the rise of fascism, so to protect, in a sense, prepare them for an age of violence and an age of nihilism, things like that.
And Bataille offered himself, didn't he? Apparently.
He did 3 times, and they refused. But within the garden itself is this amazing ruined headless column, like a massive Doric column. It's a building really, and it's like a broken column. And when you go inside there, apparently, I mean, in its original form, it had mirrors all on the inside to reflect the vegetation outside. And this tower was supposedly, this was that Bataille would be sacrificed in view of this tower. But obviously, the tower is a really fascinating structure because it's a headless structure anyway. So I'm kind of interested in the whole kind of, almost like the imagistic resonance of this kind of idea of a headless society, kind of anarchic society. There's no ruler and things like that. And the way that you inaugurate a headless society is to cut off the head of the headless, to inaugurate it. So it's very interesting in terms of its kind of almost ceremonial correspondences and this kind of imagistic resonance. And that's why I particularly was interested in especially this broken tower, which is actually very amazing. So if you ever get there, it's well worth a visit. It's very
beautiful. I'm becoming quite the fan of Bataille as well. He's kind of an interesting character in himself, isn't he? He's
very
he's almost an occultist but sort of a bit like who am I thinking of here? Like a bit like Jung, I suppose, in the sense that he doesn't like to call it occultism or esotericism. He sort of masks it behind psychology, whereas actually what he's talking about feels very much like, especially
yeah. I mean, have you read it? He did a journal called Documents, which was really kind of this kind of anthropological sort of take on surrealism. Very strange man, very quite disturbed as well. He had a very disturbing upbringing.
He did that book about the Charles de Ray book, didn't he?
He did the Trials of Gilles de Ray.
Gilles de Ray. That was it. That was it. And then the eroticism book as well, which is the
and he wrote an absolutely amazing book of erotic fiction called Story of I, which is really disturbing, really, really, really like out there, kind of sort of surrealistic sort of version of Marquis de Sade. But again,
one place. Did you go to Torrigiani Garden?
I did do, yeah.
I'm jealous.
Yeah,
I was right next to it. I was on holiday with my partner, and I can't remember why she wanted to go to the fake location of Dante's
okay,
which isn't actually his house, but which is annoying. But I would much rather have gone there. It's kind of a Masonic theme park almost, isn't it?
It is, yeah, a bit like a sort of Quinta de Greleggia in Sintra, but Torrigiani is now you can only do private visits there. So I'm I kind of was checking it up, and we actually got a tour by the old man Torrigiani, who's an ancestor. They still live there, and he kind of this old chap just took us around the garden and showed this kind of very strange observatory that supposedly has an Athena beneath it, and was originally supposed to be this kind of like the Athena was meant to be a kind of crematorium for the original Torrigiani, who was going to be laid in a mausoleum next to this tower, and then his body moved from this mausoleum and then burnt, and so the smoke would rise and go, sort of be reborn in from the tower and things like that. But I think the laws in Florence forbid sort of these sort of private cremations, so that never happened. But it's very symbolic. That particular area of the garden, there's a yew tree next to it, so very Masonic, in a sense, in the true tradition of the kind of the third degree sort of rite of masonry. I think there, so I think there's definitely something in that. Some of it's, the statue of Osiris isn't particularly well achieved, but nevertheless, the symbolism's there. What else? Something I was going to say about the garden itself. Yeah, yeah. The kind of he was sort of saying that the structure of the tower. Let me get this right. Square base, octagonal middle, and round top is sort of Masonic sort of symbolism for various degrees of initiation, things like that. So yeah, it's a very interesting trip. Yeah, yeah.
And you can
Kind of
have
cut off from reality in a weird way.
you have a meal at the end, don't you, with the family?
Yeah,
Apparently,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Quite awkward,
That's
really.
yeah, it's a bit strange.
Yeah, but yeah, sort of strangely cut off from reality in a weird way. Very
Hmm.
because of this big wall behind it. So that part of the city isn't particularly busy, but you feel even more cloistered. By this weird aristocratic family that have this garden business and stuff like this on. But it's pretty affecting actually. Yeah, yeah.
Bit of a side question, as we're in the Italian region at the moment. Have you ever been to Damanhur?
No, no, is that a
Ah,
witchcraft?
no, 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 no. Okay, well, I wasn't sure if you. I want to do a whole episode on this.
Okay.
It's a, it's kind of hard to explain. It's like this series of temples that were secretly built into the Alps, in
No, never.
just north of Turin.
Is
But I'm going to do a whole episode on it, so I won't dwell on it. I
is
just
this
wondered if
to
you'd
do
been
with
there.
Theosophists as well? Were there?
Slightly, yeah. There's a link to Theosophy, and
Yeah,
basically,
the name rings
and
a bell.
they're still there, and it's this huge community now, and they have
Wow.
these like incredible temples built into this. You have to go if you ever talk of places you need to go to.
Wow.
Damanhur is a place. I'll send you some photos
Yeah,
after,
that
and
sounds amazing. Yeah, yeah.
it's yeah, it's and but one of the other reasons I bring it up is one of the things they believe in is Atlantis, and
Right.
that's
Sort of
there you
hollow.
go. Good
That's right.
classic segue
That's
there
right.
by Ken.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, Mr. Sharp, you also visited Atlantis. Well, what was your experience of that? Was it in season or out of season? I actually got. I think the Atlantis section. I think I probably was one of the sections I got the most out of because there are like legends and things, including like the like, for want of a better word, the domestic version of Atlantis, like more local, like in Cornwall and stuff like this, which I was completely unfamiliar with, and so I got quite a lot about that. And the unfortune, the thing about, as soon as I read about the sea priestess being set at a particular place near Somerset, isn't it? It's the
Bream down. Bream down.
yeah. And also I got a bit of a frisson when you were saying, if you read the book, there's the road with the sharp bend in it, and there's actual locations you recognize from the narrative in the novel. I thought, oh yes, that really intrigued me. And so Atlantis. So what was that like? Atlantis.
Which one?
Exactly. This is it.
We actually went
This
to.
is it.
It was quite fortunate because my wife and I went on a sort of delayed honeymoon to Santorini, which turns out to be Atlantis, or um, Plato's basis for his sort of tale of hubris was based on Thera, which is obviously the old Atlantis, and yeah, the structure of Atlantis, in Plato is described as these sort of concentric islets, really, and that's a feature of kind of a volcanic explosion. Um, Went to an Atlantis theme park, which actually had a really, really brilliant diorama, sort of Hornby diorama of Atlantis. So I'll send
I
you some.
like that.
It
When I
was
read that, I was thinking,
absolutely
oh,
amazing. Yeah, I mean, I could
I was
stare at
thinking,
this.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I probably could have done some camera work and probably made a movie out of it or something like that. But yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, the volcanic islands off Thera are actually very beautiful. But as I say, as you mentioned, the bit that really fascinated me was Dion Fortune's appropriation of this this Napoleonic fortress on Bream Down, and it's a really clever bit of kind of uh, almost future occultism, and I kind of really like that, and obviously she's seen as quite a traditionalist, but actually it was quite inspired to revision this military complex. And obviously, there was a kind of old ambience there with kind of Coil, because you're not too far from where Coil ended up. So it's only about 6 or 7 miles from Weston-super-Mare, and obviously their album Sea Priestess and things like that. So this whole kind of thing constellated to create something quite atmospheric for me. And I also like the book very much in terms of its kind of all these kind of occult recipes it gives for like time travel. There's various woods in the book that they burn in order to go to different eras of stratas of consciousness and or eons and stuff like that. So I mean, I like that kind of fictive sort of appropriation of kind of military, the whole kind of military temples, that kind of thing. It's obviously that was kind of more to do with the sort of things I was exploring with English Heretic. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the kind of the kind of the whole kind of Celtic vision of Atlantis. But again, you saw the kind of the mythic drift's really interesting here, where you got this kind of morality, a certain morality associated with the destruction of Atlantis in all these kind of tellings, which is really interesting. And actually, read for the first time that story E by Robert Chambers. I think it's an absolutely amazing story. I was really pretty taken by that. So I was kind of looking here. Obviously, I was I wanted to stay clear of the whole kind of Nazi sort of take on Atlantis and steer it in a more progressive direction. So looking at things like Sun Ra and things like that. So keeping, concentrating on the fictions and the myth seemed a way of, avoiding that kind of treacherous waters, if you like.
Yeah, and the sea, and the spirit of the sea is something which repeats itself in Dion Fortune's work. I mean, in Moon Magic, you've got the sea priestess. That that's it's like a part two, isn't it? And
Yeah.
there's an image of her with walking with a cloak and a broad brimmed hat in the foggy banks of the Thames. So you've got that watery element again, and there's like I can't remember the name of the story, but there's a short story about somebody who goes to the sea, and he sort of, there's like a retreat there, and I wonder if she's using the same location, and there's like an undine or something in the
Okay.
water. Yeah, so there's like a retreat on a cliff. It's up above a cliff, and it looks directly down onto the sea.
Oh, it could have been a prototype for Sea Priestess. When was it? Yeah, because obviously, it might have been.
When you were talking, I was thinking,
Yeah.
wouldn't surprise me if that. It also looks that the actual location from your description and the picture, it looks like a very quiet, self-contained. You're not going to have lots of visitors necessarily, or that's the impression I got anyways. That it's quite a remote kind of.
It's very windswept. Yeah, very windswept.
Yeah. Oh, good. That was what I was hoping, because that's
Yeah.
with a mist coming in and all the rest of it. It looked like weirdly it's had a kind of not the same severity, but like a dungeon-esque kind of very remote. You're in a very remote part of cut off from the hubbub of the big cities and
plus you are looking. You are looking out to kind of. It very much is this is a natural promenade, so it's a spur essentially, and so it becomes it is quite if you think about it, it's quite a ritualistic passage towards the sea in a weird way. But the other thing I really find interesting about kind of the sea press is the way she turns it around. So the guy is kind of the oracular sort of sensitive, isn't he? And she's lost her knowledge, so she needs this kind of quite ephemeral, ethereal male figure to reawaken it. So it's quite an unusual sort of switch around from the usual situation we have the Magus, who's like this kind of female oracular assistant sort of.
Yeah, and one of the sort of lingering images that you sort of mentioned it there, like the bonfires they have on the beaches with the salt encrusted kind of branches that would like give off a bluish flame
Yeah,
and
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, wonderful depictions of nature and immersion in nature, and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
I
I
love
love time travel fiction anyway. You know, I love obviously things like Burroughs' Cities of the Red Knight, which I touched on in the book. And so I like this kind of, those kind of magical time travel um,
it.
visions,
What's
if you
your
like. And
what's your what's your what's your take on the Hounds of Tindalos as a sort of Lovecraftian spin-off? It's not by Lovecraft. It's Frank Belknap
I haven't read
Long.
that. I haven't read that.
Oh,
No.
what? Oh, yeah. Well, in the Hands of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long, who's a kind of student of Lovecraft, and he's got his own merits without a shadow of a doubt. And in the Hounds of Tindalos, it's somebody who travels in their mind through time
Okay.
to the distant past through hashish, I think, and then and at they travel further back in time to like the misty dawns of the beginning of things, and there's these things there, these creatures there called the Hounds of Tindalos, which then chase him. They hunt him through time
Oh,
to
right.
the
Interesting.
here and now.
We should end on. I think, well, as it's this podcast, I suppose we should probably end on the section about Crowley, really.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
that'd be good.
yeah. So let's talk a bit about that. Obviously, it's a infamous journey with Crowley and his then lover Victor Neuburg. Um, do you want to talk a little bit about why that ended up in this book in particular?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I split the book in two ways. One was looking at various schools of esotericism, so I said like Tantra, witchcraft, and the other was looking at geographical landscapes. And I've been obsessed with this particular story about Lovecraft and the desert. Can't remember since I first read it in I think Francis King book, and yeah, I wanted to explore the desert as a place of um, kind of mirages, illusion, madness, a non-place, a place without form, and I think it's infamous. Crowley's so Crowley for the people listening, Crowley and Neuburg um, recommenced a set of workings that he had originally started in Mexico about 10 years prior to them visiting the Sahara. And these were based on 30 calls to the ethers constructed by Edward Kelly and John Dee.
Yeah, the Enochian workings.
In the Enochian workings, yeah. So these ethers are kind of angels, if you like. So you go through these 30 ethers and call each of the angels and transcribe the visions. And he uses a language, Enochian and a scrying mirror or whatever, to
He used a gemstone, didn't he? I
he did
think.
he sort of. I mean, the interesting thing is that they had no when they went to Algeria. They just went on a walking holiday as lovers, really, and they wanted to just explore the desert under the night sky and things like that. So at some point, Crowley received a kind of voice that said, start these Enochian workings again, or recommence these Enochian workings. And I think they started at the 28th or 29th when the last vision had faded out, and he kind of just sort of sequestered, or he had a crucifix, and then he had a gemstone, and he kind of made it in. I think he kind of fashioned it into a scrying mirror. So I think if there's something very genuine about this kind of vision that this what didn't feel contrived, that Crowley wasn't trying to contrive some sort of experience, and I think that's where his stuff's most interesting, where that he's following a compulsion. So I'm very interested in it from the fact that it was this thing that suddenly happened where they weren't expecting it to. So they then followed each of these workings through the desert from, or where was it, from Busada to Biskra, so over 2 or 3 weeks. and they would call each of these Enochian spirits at different locations. And I think the visions are very interesting. I think that I think it's quite significant that this kind of ruby sort of gem, because they're quite fiery, the visions they have in the early sections, and you can see this kind of meld between what they're seeing in the mirror and the landscape itself. The other thing that really interests me is this kind of I think it was quite a radical, ahead of its time form of occult psychogeography. So he was taking one form of magic and performing it in a completely different terrain from where it might have been originally visualized to be, because it was formed at Mortlake, I think, wasn't it? So in London, but he took it into the desert and he sort of synthesized this kind of baroque form of angelic magic and then put it out in the desert. And that seems to me a kind of sort of thing that you would do as a kind of radical occult psychogeographer, really, to kind of synthesize a new occult terrain. And I think that's really, people often miss the fact that it was very ahead of its time in terms of, creating a new occult landscape. And so so cut to the chase, they decide to form sex magic for the first time, I think, because they feel they need to make a sacrifice, and rather than sacrifice an animal, Crowley sacrifices himself, really. So Neuberg forms sodomy on Crowley, and that becomes this kind of thing that accelerates the whole kind of process. So they're transcending their own kind of Christian taboos and things like that, and liberating themselves from their previous lives and things like that. Anyway, at the 10th ether, they conjure this demon called Corazon, the demon of dispersion, have this quite intense, amazing astral battle with this shape-shifting form that's moving through Crowley. They sacrifice some pigeons and do a blood sacrifice, so it's kind of feeding on this blood, and it's trying to jump out the circle and attack Neuberg. So it's a classic sort of stuff you saw. It's really influential in things like Devil Rides Out, and those sort of things where some demon is sort of jumping out of this kind of protective circle and shape shifting and things like that. So it had a huge sort of occultural influence on kind of our notions of like an occult battle, really, in kind of in culture, really. But I think it's really interesting as a sort of whole cultural sort of phenomenon itself. This idea of this demon called Corazon. And in the deeper chapter, I look at the kind of the immediate ramifications of this manifestation of a very sort of apocalyptic demon in the 20th century, really. So you've got Corazon that you see in the work of Jack Parsons, who kind of did a similar Black pilgrimage and went to Corazon, where he made some assumption related to Corazon, when Corazon is where the Antichrist was supposedly born in according to sort of Apocrypha. So there was an immediate effect in our culture, and then there was like these kind of homoerotic sort of takes on tantra, exclusively homosexual sort of organizations, one called the Corazon Club, that were kind of very radical because they were sort of challenging the whole idea of like heterosexual sex as being the only form of tantra and things like that. So that's very interesting. And then you've got chaos magics using kind of the cult of Corazon in a way. Peter Carroll doing the Massive Corazon, which is a kind of like anarchic anti sort of calling of the Holy Guardian Angel. So again, kind of very, very chaotic and very anarchic. And then finally, I look a bit of Grant's use of it in these very strange ways, where he was sort of fusing this dagger that supposedly was used to sacrifice these pigeons, and then it gets stolen in this Lovecraftian ritual and stuff like that. So again, but if you look at the bigger picture, what you hear is we're seeing like synthesis, wild synthesis of different kind of strains of magic and fiction, things like that. And finally, I end up looking at William Burroughs' City is a Red Night, which increasingly to me seems like a magical text. And at the beginning of City is a Red Night, he makes a dedication to Lord Pazuzu and all these kind of various forms of pestilent demons. And he doesn't mention Corazon, but I think he says something very similar to a demon of dispersion, which is very interesting, because I don't see anywhere in Burroughs' writing that he was referencing Crowley's working, but I think that Burroughs is tapping into exactly the same energies here. So in another way, I look at also the kind of tradition of desert madness as well. The idea of the Majun, the kind of the holy madman of the desert, which was what the Mad Arab in Lovecraft was, and
The Necronomicon.
who wrote the Necronomicon based on his journey in the desert, his mad journey. So yeah, it's a chapter that it's been in my head for many years, really. And I touched on the end of the English Heretic, but I was glad to get that in, because I think that was probably the chapter that's closest to the rote itself, really. It's been in my head for many years, these kind of connections.
I was really intrigued by the Burroughs material, sort of like segueing in. I didn't make that connection before, and I've not read that particular book, Cities of the Red Night.
Yeah.
So that's another one I I would like to explore, definitely. And it's like as you say, it's a I mean, Crowley did a number of magical retirements in his life, quite a few, and usually they take place, in like a hut or something like that on Aesop's Island or something like that. Is in a sort of kind of domestic situation, but he's going into the desert. It's going a place where there's a lack of stimulation. It's that in that desert environment, you're understimulated, and so this propensity to sort of go within is being facilitated by the bleakness of the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a quite important thing about because I quote, I can't remember, is it Joel? Oh, I can't remember his surname. Chaos, one of the Chaos Magician guys, Berak, who kind of says that Corazon is everything and nothing. It's like it's all your illusions coming, manifesting, but they disperse at the moment of manifestation, because everything is illusion and things like that. So this is the really interesting thing, is the kind of Corazon when Crowley's overlaying the Kabbalistic tree of life with his Enochian workings, he directly sees Corazon as mapping to Darth, the kind of empty false Sephira. So I think it's really important. It's exactly the same, Mark. That again, it's this really inspired decision to use the desert as this access to the other side through the numinous, through the void, really. And again, Grant obviously threw himself into the void post Crowley and things like that. But also, Burroughs' City of the Red Night, basically what happens is a meteorite hits these 7 cities and creates this kind of like plague, essentially. So Burroughs kind of envisaged this kind of void as well, this great big crater caused by this interplanetary event. But the other really interesting thing about Cities of Red Night is that he based it on this ritual from the Picatrix that Brian Geisen taught him, which was to recite these 4 names, which become his 6 cities of the Red Night, or whatever. But they're meant to be recited before you sleep, and they give you the power of lucid dreams. And if you read Cities of Red Night, it's quite clear that a lot of the chapters are composed from really, really pretty powerful lucid dreams.
Isn't the translation of the kind of the 6 words something like, as you go to sleep, say your invocation,
Yeah,
and
that's
have
exactly
a
what they
conversation
are.
or something?
Yeah, they are.
It sounds like an instruction. It sounds like
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's like that kind of in between place, that the liminal space between sleeping and waking. Do the
Absolutely, yeah. Suggestibility, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
But I think Burroughs' genius is to turn it into this kind of, this massive episodic sort of event, and that's the power of kind of his imagination, really. But I think more and more, I'm interested in Burroughs as a magician, really. His books were these, these, there was so much magic involved in them, especially Red Night.
Definitely.
Books are like doors, and one door leads to another, and that's the door I want to go through now. So, thank you, Mr. Sharp.
Anyway, I think that's a good time to call it a day. If people want to find you online, where should they look?
Instagram. So I'm on Instagram. I've still got my English Heretic, or English.heretic, and there's an Astral Geographic sort of promo account. But yeah, usual place, English Heretic. Still got a website, but most people just Instagram these days. So further projects will probably I'll just use that name rather than lots of different accounts. So
that brings on the next question of what's next.
Okay, so I'm back to writing, finishing off a book for Repeater tentatively called Enter the Cineplasm, and it's a kind of very much in the English Heretic vein, looking at cinema and reality and its often deleterious effects in reality. So looking at things like Jane Austen's Other Side of Underneath, Herostratus, curses, the kind of wild story that you get in English Heretic, very much a kind of metafiction, but but particularly through the lens of cinema. So that's the book I'm working on, that I'm hoping to get to the publisher for August, and that'll be out next year. So that's the thing I'm working on at the moment.
Excellent. Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure we'll have you on again soon.
I should try and meet up soon.
Yeah, meet up again soon. But anyway, so thanks again, and we'll speak to you again soon.